what we are seeing now from this second budget very clearly is that this is an old Labour budget. This is the Labour Party of old, of high taxation, high public spending, growth in welfare bills.
That's fine. I mean, that might be what you want to do, and lots of people will support that. But you might as well own it.
Exactly.
You might as well own it.
Exactly.
And say and find very clear arguments to say that this isn't the late 90s anymore. It's not the 1980s anymore. We're doing this because the demands on the state have got bigger and bigger and bigger. We live in an uncertain, insecure world, and we need the state basically to look after us.
It's Jon.
It's Lewis.
And the thing that has struck me in the sort of 12, 24 hours since the budget is the tetchiness of Starmer, of Rachel Reeves, of Torsten Bell, who we had on the podcast yesterday afternoon when we were trying to put sort of serious questions about...
He went down well with all of you.
Yeah. Isn't this a breach of trust? Can't you just admit that you have raised taxes and that you have increased spending massively and that this is not what you said you would do in the manifesto, which we were all consuming less than 18 months ago? And it's really striking how they must have known that those would be the questions that would arise out of this budget when Rachel Reeves a year ago said it was one and done, and here we are, and she's come back for more, a lot more.
Yeah, I mean, she's admitted today, Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, that working people will indeed need to pay more after the, as we were talking about yesterday, the freeze, a substantial freeze on income tax threshold. But she said that she had kept that to an absolute minimum through her other measures. And look, this is a budget where the pieces are still settling. It is notable there is pretty negative, almost universally negative reaction across the different bits of the press, more or less. A lot from the economics sort of commentariat, also pretty scathing, particularly on this question of a lack of growth, which is again something we were talking about yesterday, which is basically what Reeves is doing is sort of moving the pieces around on the board rather than growing the size of the board or changing the game. So that's all pretty bad. The one area or the one group of people who have been considerably more sanguine, apart from the markets in fairness, have been Labour MPs who have reacted pretty positively to it. There haven't been noises off. There have been very few critics sort of articulating any sort of deep criticism insofar as there has been. It's just some of the sort of soft left, more left-wing MPs saying, great start, but would like to see this go a lot further. And I think what is absolutely true to say is that, if you really strip out the big story, all of the noise of the first 18 months of this Labour government and the two budgets, the two big fiscal events that we've seen, what we actually see is a government which in many ways is classic bread and butter social democracy. A classic centre-left to left-wing government which is using the means of the state, the mechanisms of the state to be highly distributive. Yes, it's not doing the things that its most left-wing critics would like, which is to borrow even more. It's borrowing quite a lot, but borrow even more and spend even more. But if you compare it, we're still basically living in a time of scarcity, in the sense that the British state has less and less money each year than it might have done if growth had kept up as it did before 2008. And the demands upon the state are getting bigger and bigger every year because of an ageing population and other things. You've had two chancellors in particular who have had two different approaches to how to meet those challenges. One was George Osborne, who basically did most of it through spending cuts on an 80-20 ratio. Rachel Reeves is doing the exact opposite. She's not cutting spending. She is keeping spending going. It's not rising as highly as it might have done in the past, but she's still spending a lot of money, especially on welfare and in certain government departments like health. She is financing it through tax increases at almost exactly the same ratio, inversely to George Osborne. That is a big, different economic and political story than that which we saw under the Tory governments.
Of course, you're absolutely right. But that is not the argument that Labour made to the British people during the general election.
No, they didn't make any argument.
Well, they said that we were going to be the fastest growing economy in the G7. We were going to be, the kind of our number one mission was economic growth. Everything was going to be done to unleash those forces so that Britain became, productivity increased and economic growth would rise as a result of it. And what have we seen in this budget? We've seen next to nothing that will generate economic growth. And we got that quote that, we mentioned yesterday from the OBR, which says that we've assessed that none of the policy measures in this budget have a sufficiently material impact to justify adjusting our post-measures potential output forecast. In other words, there's nothing here that is going to generate economic growth. That is not the arguments that Labour made during the general election. And so I'm not surprised that a lot of the questions have been, but haven't you lied to us? Haven't you told us you would do one thing and you're doing something quite different? And that is always, rightly so, an uncomfortable place for politicians, because if you want to get disenchantment, if you want to get disillusionment, if you want to increase cynicism, then you promise one thing and deliver something else.
Well, I think the question is, it's two questions. One is the centrepiece of the budget, as we were saying yesterday, is around income tax thresholds. And the Chancellor has chosen to freeze those rather than increase income taxes because the Treasury thinks that people don't notice it as much. There's been a huge amount of coverage to it over the last 24 hours. I suspect there will continue to be considerably more coverage over it over the coming days. Most people don't know what fiscal drag is. Sounds fun, but it's not. Believe me, I've tried it, and it is something that is starting. I know it is something that is potentially now starting to enter the political consciousness in a more significant way. Just because, as we were saying yesterday, occasionally you've had chancellors who sort of mess around with those thresholds a little bit or freeze them, but this is going to go on for such a long time, basically for a decade. Started on the Tories for a decade, and such a profound restructuring of our tax system that it is possible it starts to increase in salience. And so the question is whether the public do start to notice it, and or, the second question, if they do notice it, does Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer, or do Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer have the communication skill to be able to explain why it is they've done what they've done? I mean, I would say probably gently, if the last 24 hours or anything to go by, probably if the last 16 months or anything to go by, the answer might well be no.
Yeah, and that is, look, it's fine. What we are seeing now from this second budget very clearly is that this is an old Labour budget. This is the Labour Party of old, of high taxation, high public spending, growth in welfare bills and all the rest of it, with no particular measures that you can see on the horizon that are going to lead to dramatic reform of that, and an increased tax take to pay for that. Now, that is going back a bit. I mean, that was as far away from, the Blair mantra and the Blair kind of economics. Now, of course, the world has changed since then. The 2008 financial crash has changed an awful lot of the calculus and the kind of the way we view the global economy. But I do think that this puts Labour in a position now where it is very much a party of old that, people in the 70s and early 80s would recognise.
Although, in fairness, the interest that so many of the current crop of Labour MPs have in child poverty, indeed Rachel Reeves herself, is born from the legacy of the Blair government. I mean, the Blair government, was partly because of Gordon Brown's influence, who have been very influential on this budget as well, and this question of the welfare of the benefit cap. One of the key metrics that it talked about all the time was child poverty, and indeed it had a very successful record on child poverty. So in a way, I think, John, you're right that in its hallmarks and the way it is approaching politics, it is in lots of ways a more sort of classic iteration of Labour, sort of pre-New Labour. But there are sort of New Labour kind of hangovers, that one of the reasons they're all so interested in child poverty is partly because it was cast such a long shadow from the New Labour years.
Yeah, and look, you can't go back and rewind the clock and just say that the New Labour policies kind of did everything. They didn't do everything. Although, as you say, there were all sorts of kind of things like Sure Start and whatever else that were kind of made a significant contribution towards the alleviation of child poverty. What I'm struck by is surely your economic policy, if you want to generate growth, is you've got to grow the size of the cake, that you've got to make the economy bigger. And in that sense, I think there have been a variety of measures that have been introduced in these last two budgets, which I can't imagine a Blair government ever introducing, that would have had such an effect on business, and employee national insurance contribution. And although there's been, I think, a bit of a sigh of relief from some sections in business that this budget could have been a lot worse, it's that kind of judgment that not much is happening that is going to grow the economy significantly.
Well, what I'd say is I think the danger for Labour here is that they're caught betwixt and between two things, which is that it is clear, as I say, the big story of these two budgets is in many respects Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer nudging us towards a more continental style European social democracy sort of economy, right, where the state is bigger and bigger, more money is taken from the economy in taxation, working people on middling incomes do pay more in tax, and that is spent on public services and welfare. It's nudging us closer towards the European direction and away from the American direction, and we've always sat somewhere in between. That's fine. I mean, that might be what you want to do, and lots of people will support that, but you might as well own it.
Exactly.
You might as well own it.
Exactly.
And say, and find very clear arguments to say that this isn't the late 90s anymore, it's not the 1980s anymore, we're doing this because the demands on the state have got bigger and bigger and bigger, we live in an uncertain, insecure world, and we need the state basically to look after us. Now, I'm not saying that's right or wrong, I'm just saying that is basically the direction they're going in, and they might as well own it. Because, and in a way, their problems for them up to now, in a sense, have not been owning it from the beginning, because that was always their sort of instinct, and they didn't level with people enough about it. So, you're going into the election saying that they're not going to increase taxes on working people. Let's be clear, they are increasing taxes on working people. And a freeze in income tax threshold is tantamount to an increase in income tax in all but name. And indeed, I think probably, and we saw them lead up to this, in our heart of hearts, the Chancellor would have preferred, it would have been cleaner, simpler and fairer, for all sorts of slightly complicated reasons, just to increase income tax. I think it would have been politically disastrous because of the manifesto commitment, but she's clearly backed away from that for that reason. But there's a Resolution Foundation who, say very close to Labour, have said, just in the last 24 hours, that sticking to that manifesto pledge and freezing income tax thresholds rather than just raising income taxes actually hurt lower middle income earners most. And they're saying that in effect they have broken the pledge regardless, because the tax burden on working people has increased by 26 billion in this budget alone. So, it is that I think they're caught in a bit of a vice where their instincts and what they're trying to do and what they want to do, and what their backbenchers are comfortable doing, is nudging us in that more classic social democratic direction. Torsten Bell, when he sat down yesterday before we started recording, we were having a bit of a joke about taxes going up, and he said, "What? You don't want proper bread and butter social democracy?" That's the direction of travel. That's how they're thinking, right? But they're not being explicit enough with the public and explaining the reasons why.
And I just think, look, 3 times yes, own it. If this is what you're doing, own it and make the argument for it. But what I think lands really, really badly with the public, and I was struck by it when we were interviewing Torsten Bell yesterday, and I think I said to him, for God's sake, just have some humility and tell us truthfully that yes, you've raised taxes and this is why you've done it, rather than trying to pretend that everything is not what we can clearly see. And I think that is where politics gets itself such a bad rep, when everyone can see with their own eyes what it's going to do to their own household income and what it's going to do to their savings or whatever it happens to be. And yet Labour is trying to pretend that it's absolutely not that, it's all fine, and that these were necessary measures. Look, you've taken the measures. You promised in the kind of manifesto that you'd need 8 billion in tax rises. So far, in the 16 months of this government, you're going for 66 billion in tax rises. That is quite a big difference. Now, you've got to have a story that accompanies that. And at the moment, they're saying there's nothing to see here. There's plenty to see here. Just tell us what it is.
Or that they're having to do it because of unforeseen circumstances. And honestly, that just doesn't wash. It doesn't wash because everything they cite happened they knew about. Yes, there is the OBR downgrade in productivity. Hard thing to talk about. Very hard thing. As soon as you mentioned it, people have already turned off. And even though there is some truth to it, but the fact of the matter is that the things they cite, whether it was Brexit, whether it was COVID, whether it was the Ukraine war, whatever it is, that was all known about in July 2024. The Chancellor knew about that when she made her manifesto pledges. By all accounts, she said, in terms of boxing herself in on those income tax pledges and so on, she said, well, that will be a nice problem to have. Well, it's turned out not to be a nice problem to have. It's been turned out to be a vice around her. And the argument to say that things are a bit worse than all those things that we knew about isn't very credible, isn't very convincing, because you knew how bad they were, roughly. Yes, the OBR might have come back and said they were even worse, but you knew about them. So why did you not take account of them when you made that pledge in the first place?
And we had Paul Johnson, who was then running the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the kind of, the economists and analysts who go through all these numbers, who kept on saying during the election campaign, this is all bullshit. you're going to have to raise taxes significantly. There is a black hole. You've got to be honest with the British people. And Labour, for understandable reasons in campaigning terms, wanted to absolutely minimise what they would have to do. And now they're in government. Everything that Paul Johnson said has turned out to be correct, that they would need to raise taxes significantly. And that is what happened yesterday.
Right, when we come back, we're going to be talking to the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, Lucy Powell, who, as we've talked about on the show before, has this intriguing position where she's sort of half in, half out of the tent, both Keir Starmer's deputy, but also elected very much only a few weeks ago as a riposte to Starmer's leadership by the party members themselves. We're going to ask her what she made of yesterday's budget. Stay with us. Well, we're joined now by Lucy Powell, the Deputy Leader, still relatively freshly minted Deputy Leader of the Labour Party. Lucy Powell, thanks so much for joining us again on the Newsagents. Very simple question, really. What did you think of the budget? Was it everything you hoped it might be?
Well, look, it was a good, strong Labour budget from a Labour government. And I think, look, we can't do everything in one budget. So it's part of a longer term programme. But I thought, what Rachel set out was really positive, lifting the 2-child benefit cap in particular, but also setting out a fairer tax system and how we're going to deliver the kind of change that the country has voted for. And I thought there was a really clear narrative about that. And I think it's important now that we all come together as one Labour team and really take head on some of the arguments that she's begun to open up and make the case over the coming weeks as to why the decisions that we've taken are the right ones in the long-term interest of the country.
You and others have argued recently about the potential merits of a wealth tax. There was no wealth tax in there. Did that disappoint you? Is that something you'd like to see in the future?
I don't know that I particularly specified
I've spoken
that.
to you about it during the deputy leadership contest. You said it thought it was a good idea.
I think, there were definitely some big measures in this budget around a fairer tax system, equalising taxes on income earned from assets, for example, rather than just on work, the mansion tax, if you want to call it as that. That builds on further measures that Rachel had set out in a previous government, the previous budget rather, on the VAT on private schools, private jets, many other changes. So there definitely is part of a wider programme here of making a fairer tax system so that it's not just the many, if you like, that pay for things. We do have to tackle inequalities right across the tax system.
There is quite a lot of criticism this morning, not just from other parts of the political spectrum, which you'd expect, but from think tanks, even from Labour-friendly think tanks, including the Resolution Foundation, about this question of freezing income tax thresholds. Now, in opposition, Rachel Reeves, when she was Shadow Chancellor, said that hit working people in their pockets. Do you agree?
Well, I think she levelled with people about that in her statement yesterday. We face a very difficult environment that we're in. Things are changing all the time.
But you are increasing taxes on working people.
We are dealing with years and years of austerity. We need to invest in the country. We need to invest in public services. We need to invest in the infrastructure so that we can turn the economy round.
But would you accept, Lucy Powell, would you accept that you are increasing taxes on working people?
We have frozen the thresholds, as you rightly say, and obviously that is everybody is having to pay towards that. But we have introduced a range of other measures that really will support the most in need. You said
you wouldn't increase taxes on working people. That was a manifesto promise.
I've got the manifesto right here in front of me, Lewis, because I keep a copy on my desk at home, and. I think that the budget set out was very strongly in the spirit of the manifesto. There's a lot of things in our manifesto, like reducing child poverty, like getting waiting lists down, like ensuring that we deal with the cost of living crisis, that we get wages up, that we build more social housing. There's a huge programme that we set out in this manifesto. And this budget is not the only thing. This budget is not the only thing we're doing. It's part of that programme of renewal that we set out very strongly in our manifesto that we're delivering on people. And the first word it says there is change. And people want change. They want change to the way the economy works, the way the country works. And that's what we're setting about doing. And look, and I'm up for that fight. Sure. I'm up for that conversation about who pays and how that's done. And that's what I think we should be taking head on in the coming weeks.
But we interviewed one of the Treasury ministers yesterday, Torsten Bell, and tried to ask the same question. Why is it so difficult just to give a straight answer to that simple question? Are taxes going up for working people? The answer is yes.
Well, more people clearly are going to be drawn into into paying different levels of taxes. That's what Rachel made absolutely clear. She had a clear ask there. She had a clear ask. But our manifesto, I'm very happy with the fact that our manifesto, we are following through on our manifesto commitments.
Let me just ask you,
which are far-ranging and are really important.
Sure.
And I'd really like to talk to you about how we are doing some of those things, because there are deep problems in the way in which our economy has worked over the last.
Well, let me just ask you this.
We're addressing those.
So one of we're talking about the manifesto, and there was that whole period, maybe a week, 2 weeks, where we thought income taxes were going to be increased, and there was all that pitch rolling and the extraordinary Rachel Reeves news conference that took place at 8:10 in the morning, where she kind of hinted at such. I was told there were two reasons principally why she didn't go ahead with that. One was a Danny Finkelstein op-ed article saying that she would have to resign if she did that. The other was Lucy Powell.
Well, I think I'm quite happy to have influence, which I have influence. We are one Labour team working through these difficult issues and questions, trying to make the right decisions for the country. And it isn't easy, because the legacy that we are dealing with is deep and difficult, and it is going to take long-term decisions to turn those things around.
So let me just ask. Can I just ask you this?
I am pleased. Look, I am pleased that we are sticking by our manifesto commitments. I think that's important that we do that, and they include big, strong commitments to reducing child poverty, to reducing waiting lists, to making the country work in the interests of ordinary working people, to increase wages, build social housing, all the good Labour things that we were elected to do. And this budget this week was a clear Labour budget that we are now clearly governing as Labour. And I think that's something we should all be welcoming.
Can I ask you how much input you had into the framing of the budget? Were you at political cabinet meetings? Were you at cabinet meetings? I just kind of want to get an impression.
Well, I'm not going to go into all the sort of private discussions or anything like that. But look, I'm the deputy leader of the Labour Party. I think when I was last in your studio, you asked me about, would I be able to influence things? Would I be able to affect my role as deputy leader? And yes, I am doing that, and I'm really clear about that. Operating politically, helping the Labour government to tell that strong story about our Labour values and our Labour purpose. And I fully support Rachel and Keir in the decisions that they've taken this week, which are Labour and do show our values and our purpose. And I'm really up for having that big fight with our political opponents, especially on the right, who say that we shouldn't be taking action to tackle child poverty, who say that we shouldn't be taking the steps that we are taking to make the tax system fairer. And I disagree with them on that. And I'm up for that argument, and I'm up for that fight.
Did you argue against breaking those manifesto pledges? Because that was clearly the direction of travel.
I don't know if it was the direction of travel or not. I'm sure that there'll be long discussions about all the sort of speculation in the lead up to this particular budget. But I think what we all wanted, and actually what Rachel and Keir really wanted as well, was that we were clearly delivering that Labour budget, a budget that was about change. It was about changing the way the economy works. The Tories and Reform, who are economic bedfellows, completely locked in terms of their view of how the economy works, which is a trickle-down economy, as the status quo economy. We want to change the economy so that it works in the interests of the many, and it's going to take more than one budget to do that. It's a whole series of things that we're doing, and and I'm here to help tell that story and make sure that our values and our purpose really do shine through as the Labour government.
Do you think this was a different sort of budget? A different sort of budget politically, which I think you sort of hinted at just now, than Rachel Reeves' first budget?
Well, I actually thought our first budget was a very Labour budget, but maybe we didn't follow through strongly enough in making some of those arguments at that time. But, the first Labour budget also prioritised investing in the NHS, long-term capital investment so that we can increase productivity and make sure that we've got a higher wage, some more secure employment economy and so on. So I think we are doing these. We've done lots of good Labour things over the last 15, 16 months since we won the election. But what people have been saying to me and to others in recent weeks is they want to see this clearer sense of purpose. They want to see the Labour bit of the Labour government coming through a lot more strongly. And that's why I really welcome the measures and the big, bold decisions. They were big, bold decisions. Rachel knew that lifting the 2-child benefit cap would be decried by our political opponents and would lead to the right-wing press and others saying it was the wrong decision. It was the right decision to lift it because in the long run, we pay a lot more for dealing with all the consequences of child poverty than lifting the cap alone would cost.
So when you say it wasn't Labour enough and now is more Labour and needs to be more Labour still, do you mean more left wing?
No, I think people want a clearer sense of our story, of our purpose, of our values coming through. And that's not to say that things that we've been doing up till now have not been Labour. I just think we haven't been able to more strongly tell that story, and that's why taking some big decisions, some big, bold, strong decisions that Rachel has taken in this budget, I think really help us to do that, and they reopen more strongly those political divides that exist in our politics today, with the Tories and reform on the one hand, who want, as I say, more austerity. They want trickle-down economics. They want the status quo to carry on in our economy. And you've got Labour on the other side. We want that big change in the way that the country works and the way that the economy works, so that ordinary working people get the benefit of economic growth and our economic prosperity. And we are going about doing that.
But ordinary working people are going to be paying for the huge amounts of extra money that's going to be spent on welfare, with no sign that any serious, meaningful reform in the welfare budget is taking place. We saw what had happened in the summer and, the failure of that, which I think you kind of said it was a misguided adventure in the first place to do that welfare reform. We've also had the OBR saying that there is no measure in this budget that is going to have a serious impact on economic growth. So the economy is not growing, taxpayers are paying more, and there is no attempt to cut down the kind of ballooning welfare bills either.
Well, the stagnant growth we've seen over the last 15 years, that is going to take a while to turn around. But the OBR, they make these forecasts and they usually have to end up revising them up, as they have done for the short-term growth in their latest forecasts. They haven't costed in, lots of measures that we've already taken and that we are taking to increase growth. So let's see what actually happens there. Look, on welfare, we have been, under the Tories, by the way, welfare spending ballooned at the same time that child poverty went up massively as well, because they were constantly chasing in the welfare system that we had and the economy that we had in the past and that we're trying to change. We are spending a lot of money dealing with the symptoms of a broken economy and not its root causes. So we are effectively, in this country now, we subsidise low pay, we subsidise high housing costs, and we pay more and more for dealing with the symptoms of things like child poverty than we do in investing in getting them right. So we need a higher wage, decent job market in this country. We need to build more social housing, which is what we are doing to drive down those high housing costs, which we subsidise. And then we need to deal with the root causes of child poverty, of better education, better health, people having more money in their pockets to bring up their children outside of poverty, and not just spend more and more on food banks, on charities, on teachers having to spend time supporting children and all the costs that linger through our economy for a long time. Just as an example, children in poverty, only a quarter of them go on to get 5 good GCSEs. You know, my kids in a more affluent background, like my kids, will three quarters of them will get 5 good GCSEs.
But Lucy, can you imagine a world? Can you imagine any world where Labour MPs will go through the division lobbies to vote for welfare cuts to keep the cost down?
As I've said time and time again, you know, the PLP are absolutely up for a conversation and up for looking at how we can reduce welfare and welfare reform.
It needs to be a bit more of a conversation, though, doesn't it, Lucy? I mean, it is spiralling, the costs.
It's not just it's not just a conversation. We are up for that. And by the way, one of the other real legacies, you know, in our welfare system at the moment, which we're seeing so starkly coming through, is the number of young people outside of jobs or education.
Would you ever vote for cuts? Would you ever vote for cuts? Can you imagine a world where you voted for actual cuts to welfare?
We need to reform welfare. I think when we're trying to short-term cut welfare, not looking at the outcomes of how we can deliver better outcomes for people.
Sure, but we do need to spend less, don't we? We do need to spend less. So I'm just asking you, is there a package where you could vote for cuts in welfare?
I would vote every day of the week for better systems that deliver better outcomes, that often require in the first instance for you to invest in that, which over time lead to those budgets going down and down. I'll give you another example, by the way. Here in Manchester, we're the only local authority where the number of children going into care is now falling, not rising. And this is a very, very high need, poor city. And why is that? Because the City Council and partners up here have invested hugely into early intervention and support in the very earliest years through the Sure Start model and other measures to make sure that families are better supported so that children don't need to go into care. So that is now reducing the children's services bill in this city, and it's taken some investment to do that. It's delivering better outcomes and it's reducing costs, but it's not driven purely by a need to short-term reduce costs.
But at the moment right now, combined incapacity and disability benefits, we're now spending about £64.5 billion on those benefits. That is up by 40% in real terms since 2013. So there clearly may be a moment when you and Labour MPs are confronted with the prospect of not just reforming the system, not just spending money in the short term on the system, but having to vote for cuts. So I'm just going to ask one more time. Is there any world where you would vote for cuts in disability-related benefits?
Well, it's a bit of a ridiculous question, to be honest.
Really?
Because I want to get the welfare bill down. Because the welfare bill being so high is a symptom of failure. It's a symptom of our failure to deal with the root causes of why welfare is so high. People out of work, people who are in work, who can't, but work doesn't pay for them, so we're having to subsidise it. People in expensive yet awful private rented housing. People struggling to get by. People on young people who, after COVID, you know, I've got a 21-year-old, and I'm sure you've experienced this as well. Young people who were completely thrown on the scrap heap by the previous government after COVID because they didn't invest in those COVID catch-up years that they needed to do, who are now consigned to a life of being on benefits. We've got to turn that around. I want to see the welfare bill coming down because it's a symptom of failure across a range of things. And there's no silver bullet for that. Just taking money off people doesn't solve that problem. It just creates you other problems elsewhere. We've got to deal with the root causes, and that's what we are doing as a Labour government, investing in social housing, a young people's job guarantee, making sure that work pays and that there are decent jobs there for people, investing in the new industries of the future. And that's how we will get the welfare bill down.
This budget is being characterised as more about party management than what is right for the country. Has Keir Starmer bolstered his position and Rachel Reeves bolstered her position? Are they there now for the long haul, or there are still dangers ahead come the May local elections?
They were always there for the long term. They are in it for the long term. We support them in the long term.
But you know how sulphurous the mood has been on the backbenches. Arguably, your election as deputy leader was the absolute vivid symbol of how unhappy Labour backbenchers were with the direction of travel, and you've influenced the shape of this budget. I ask you again, are Labour MPs happy now?
This was a good, strong Labour budget, which we are all absolutely behind. We really, really are. I just want to make that absolutely clear. Keir and Rachel were brought in, or elected rather, as our Prime Minister and our Chancellor only 15, 16 months ago, and they are in it for the long term, and we are all in it for the long term.
So what would you say? So what would you say to your colleagues who are still thinking maybe we can change the Prime Minister?
Well, they're not thinking that. Absolutely, and we will all be supporting, continuing to support them going forward. And I do reject this idea that somehow this is a sort of budget for Labour backbenchers, not a budget for the country. You know, tell that to the 5,500 children here in Manchester Central who are now, over the next 2 or 3 years, going to be lifted out of poverty because of decisions that we have taken. These are the right decisions for the country, and this is a good Labour budget, and it's one that we are all going to proudly go through the voting lobbies next Tuesday to vote for. Every single Labour MP will be doing that.
You're saying that there's no one's plotting to remove the Prime Minister?
No.
No one at all. All those plots we've been reading about, centred on Wes Streeting and others, just nonsense, not happening. There are no Labour MPs. There are no Labour MPs, Lucy, who are thinking it might be a good idea to remove the Prime Minister in the next 12 months.
Well, it's not a good idea. You know, we've got to face out to the country now, and we've got to be really clear about that, about our purpose, about our values, about what we are doing. We've got a big job of work to do, and it's not over just because we've delivered this budget this week. This budget this week is helping us to re-establish the agenda that we're pursuing, to help us have those big arguments out in the country about the long-term decisions that we are taking to get the country back on track in all of those ways, whether that is the public services, whether that's good, decent jobs, but whether that is about the country and the economy working for the many and not the few. And I know that every Labour MP this weekend and beyond is going to be out making those arguments, and they're the arguments we should be talking about, and not any other tittle-tattle.
So you're 100% confident that the Prime Minister and Chancellor will still be Prime Minister and Chancellor, taking your party into the next election?
Yes.
Lucy Powell, Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I thought what was interesting there with Lucy Powell was she wasn't going to obviously give me chapter and verse of the meetings that she had been in, but I thought there was a kind of almost smug satisfaction that, yep, I've had an influence. You want to believe it. I've played my part in shaping this budget. And I think that, you know, an awful lot of Labour backbenchers will be very happy that she has.
I'm sure her election in and of itself, was significant in terms of the psychology of Number 10 and Keir Starmer's thinking, because they could see that even within the Labour Party, his position was becoming shakier and more difficult, and that therefore that would have affected the sort of course of the budget. And as we say...
And in answer to your question, 100%.
100%, exactly. And she didn't always sound like that during the leadership campaign, notably. I thought that her answers on welfare were very, very revealing, in a sense that, look, there is a lot of good reasons. There are a lot of good reasons why welfare spending have gone up. We should never forget as well that the mainstay of welfare spending is pensions, which government after government has prioritised via the maintenance of the triple lock. Nonetheless, we can see that particularly with sickness and disability related benefits and other forms of benefits as well, these are rising very, very rapidly, particularly among young people. And I think that you can kind of see in her answers, or hear in her answers, the psychology of a lot of Labour MPs, which is that Labour has sort of got itself into a position psychologically, perhaps because of the MPs that it's got and their background sometimes, where it is almost a sort of third rail to even contemplate voting for something that might cut discrete or particular benefits, and that is un-Labour in some way. And I think that is a very complicated and very difficult bit of psychology to get into, because it almost implies that almost any sort of expansion of that spending and the state is inherently a good thing. Now, I hear what she's saying, of course. Like, very often when you reform welfare, it might mean you have to spend a bit more up front in order to change the system, and you don't want to do what the government did, which is just come along with some blanket cuts and just say, here you go, you want to think about it more thoughtfully. But ultimately, the aim there's got to be two aims with welfare reform, right? Like, one is to create a better system which is more helpful to people, both who really need that assistance, but also in helping them get back into work. But also, it will be to spend less money, ultimately, than we might have done otherwise, because, frankly, the British economy isn't sufficiently productive right now to justify or to pay for the sheer the galloping rates of increase that we're seeing.
Well, look, you talked about the real-term growth in kind of disability benefits that are being paid now by the state. What if they continue to grow?
Indeed.
Do you come back for more and more and more taxation to cover that? Or do you start saying, well, hang on, are we really that sick as a society compared to our European neighbours, where they're not seeing those same increases in spending in the way that we are here? And those are big questions for Labour to answer. At the moment, looking at this parliamentary Labour Party, I'd say there is absolutely no appetite whatsoever for voting for welfare cuts. We've seen it in practice this summer. And, you know, unless it is dressed up very, very differently, it's hard to see them doing that again.
And some analyses have said, and I mentioned that 67 billion figure to Lucy Powell, some analyses have said that working age sickness / disability and incapacity spending could reach over 100 billion by the end of the decade. I'd say that's up from about 65 billion now. You know, that is not a sustainable rate of increase. It's not sustainable for the people involved. It's not sustainable for the British state. It's also not Labour. It's not a Labour thing to want people to see. I mean, Lucy Powell mentioned Labour and Labour values many, many times in that interview. It is, I'm sure she would agree with the statement that it isn't Labour to want to see people be on benefits when they don't need to be, and when they could be in work and they could be living a more flourishing life and so on. But then it's all very well saying that. At some point you might have to vote for something that does entail maybe a bit of pain or a bit of difficulty in order to get to the end goal. And yeah, you want to do it comprehensively and you want to do it thoughtfully. But I'm struck by the lack of urgency about it, because this is a huge part, a hugely increasing part of public spending. And we should not forget, you know, for every pound that we spent on increasing that budget is a pound less that we can spend on education, which now, for example, looks like it's forecast to fall in real terms in terms of school funding per pupil, on defence, on the health service, on all of these things. And yes, sometimes those things are interrelated, those bits of spending, but nonetheless, you know, I would have thought that certainly for any Labour MP, they would far rather see as many pounds spent as possible on education and on health and whatever it happens to be, than on spending on a system which is clearly not fit for purpose and is getting worse. In slightly more positive news for the government, though, which is something we'll be hearing about a lot, I'm sure, there were some figures released today, not to do with the economy, but to connect with migration. Net migration, the ONS is saying, has fallen sharply to just over 200,000 in a year to June. That is a fall from 649,000 for the year before, and it's a drop of nearly 80% from its 2023 peak. So, you know, there's a very substantial fall. Going back to the sort of figures that we used to see pre-Brexit, about 200,000 a year. Obviously, the government will be talking about this a lot. It's fair to say some of it is definitely down to the reforms that the Conservatives brought in in the tail end of their period, particularly James Cleverly as Home Secretary. But, you know, politics is politics, and I'm sure the government won't be having that.
Well, the government will be taking a victory lap on that.
It's also to say a lot of people are leaving the country as well.
Which is not such good
perhaps
news
not
necessarily.
Such good news. Might be.
Anyway.
Some of it is obviously immigrants going home. Some of it is British people going to move abroad. But anyway, I think that is the 204,000 in the year to June. That is a figure you'll be hearing a lot over the course of the next few months.
Well, I promise that Lewis and I will be here tomorrow. We're not going anywhere.
We're not emigrating.
We're not emigrating.
Some of them want to re-emigrate us. That's the latest thing.
And we will be joined by the acclaimed, the brilliant novelist Sir Salman Rushdie, and that should be fascinating. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.